Imagine you are standing on a cobblestone street in Stockholm during the first few weeks of 2025. The air is crisp and smells like toasted cardamom from a nearby bakery. Everything looks perfect. The streets are clean. The public transport is silent and on time. People walk past in expensive minimalist coats that probably cost more than a month of rent in most other countries. You watch the soft glow of designer lamps in the windows of apartments that look like they belong in a high-end furniture catalog. It feels like the ultimate victory of human civilization. But then you look a little closer at the headlines on the digital kiosks. One shocking report from late 2024 shows that Sweden has transitioned from one of the safest countries in the world to having one of the highest rates of gun violence per capita in Europe. You probably thought this place was just a peaceful utopia of IKEA furniture and endless paid vacation days. Now, a deep sense of unease is starting to settle over the snowy capital. How did the world's most successful social experiment start to show such deep, jagged cracks? If you look at the numbers, the perfect Swedish life was built on a mountain of very cheap debt. For years, interest rates were actually negative. Banks were practically paying people to take out massive mortgages for those beautiful apartments. Now, the bill is finally coming due. Throughout 2025, a wave of high interest rates has hit Swedish households harder than almost anywhere else in the developed world. Most Swedes don't have fixed-rate mortgages. They have floating rates that change every few months. When the central bank, known as the Riksbank, hiked rates to fight inflation, the monthly payments for families doubled or even tripled overnight. You notice the mood shift in the local coffee shops. People are still buying their lattes, but they are looking at their banking apps with a look of genuine fear. The luxury facade is still there, but the foundation is shaking. One major beat in this story involves the sheer volume of household debt. Swedes are among the most indebted people in Europe. It wasn't a problem when money was free, but as 2025 progressed, the Riksbank found itself in a corner. If they lowered rates to help families, the Swedish krona would crash. If they kept rates high, the housing market would implode. This was a high-stakes gamble with the entire middle class as the collateral. You trace the data and see that retail spending started to crater by mid-year. People stopped buying the designer coats. They started looking for ways to cut back on the very things that made the Swedish lifestyle feel so premium. Here's the thing about the Swedish model. It relies on everyone being productive and the economy constantly growing to fund the massive welfare state. But by 2025, the growth just stopped. Imagine sitting in a sleek boardroom at a tech startup in Stockholm's Silicon Alley. The atmosphere is tense. A notification pings on a laptop. It is a filing showing another round of layoffs. This is a micro scene playing out across the city. Investors are pulling back. The unicorn factory that produced Spotify and Klarna is starting to sputter. The venture capital is drying up because the risks in the Swedish economy are suddenly looking too high. Then there is the welfare squeeze. For decades, the deal was simple. You pay high taxes, and the government takes care of everything. But in 2025, the wait times for basic health care reached record highs. You hear stories of people waiting a year for a standard hip surgery, or months just to see a specialist. Finance people still go back and forth on whether the system is simply underfunded or fundamentally broken. Some argue that the aging population is just too heavy for the current tax base to support. Others say the money is being diverted to deal with the rising costs of social instability and crime. Either way, the safety net is starting to feel more like a tightrope. Think about the local grocery stores for a second. You walk down the aisles and see the prices of basic goods like butter and coffee. They have skyrocketed. Because Sweden imports so much, the weak krona makes everything more expensive. A verifiable event from early 2025 was a sudden spike in food bank usage in a country that supposedly eliminated poverty. Seeing a line for free bread in a wealthy Stockholm suburb is a visual that many locals never thought they would witness. It is a total culture shock. It challenges the very idea of what it means to be Swedish. The tension is most visible in the housing market. Imagine a young couple who bought their dream home in 2022. They did everything right. They have good jobs. They saved their money. But now, their mortgage payment is more than half of their take-home pay. They are house poor. They have a beautiful home but can't afford to heat it properly or go out to dinner. This is the silent crisis of 2025. It is not a sudden crash with buildings being boarded up. It is a slow, grinding exhaustion. It is the sound of thousands of people checking their bank balances every single morning with a knot in their stomach. Now look closer at the Riksbank's decisions. There was a moment in the spring of 2025 when the governors met to decide on the next rate move. The pressure from the public to cut rates was massive, but the inflation data came in higher than expected. The decision to hold rates steady was a turning point. It signaled that the era of easy living was officially over. This decision had immediate consequences. Small businesses that were hanging on by a thread started to file for bankruptcy. You see the for lease signs appearing in neighborhoods that used to be the heart of the city's social life. The Swedish dream was always about security. It was the idea that no matter what happened, you would be okay. But that security was tied to an economic reality that no longer exists. The global economy has changed, the way people work has changed, and the costs of maintaining that dream have become astronomical. You watch as a national conversation shifts from how do we expand the welfare state to what can we afford to cut. It is a painful transition. There is a specific feeling in the air during these months. It is the feeling of a party ending and the lights coming on. You notice it in the way people talk about the future. There is less talk about grand social projects and more talk about personal survival. The Swedish model was a beacon for the rest of the world for nearly a century. But as the cracks in the glass house become too big to ignore, people are starting to ask if it can be saved. Wait for the evening news to come on in a typical Swedish living room. The lead story isn't about a new green energy project. It is about a shooting in a suburb that was once considered perfectly safe. Then, the next segment covers the falling value of the National Pension Fund. The contrast is jarring. The old Sweden of peace and prosperity is fighting a losing battle against a new reality of debt and disorder. The consequence of decades of low interest rates and high social spending is finally hitting the front door. So what happens when the middle class realizes the safety net isn't there to catch them? They start to change their behavior, they save more, they spend less. They become more skeptical of the government. You trace the rise of this skepticism in the local newspapers. Opinion pieces are questioning the high tax rates for the first time in generations. If the services are failing, why are we still paying so much? This is the core conflict that began to define the start of 2025. It isn't just an economic crisis. It is a crisis of identity for an entire nation. The pristine image of the Swedish welfare state always relied on a very specific kind of math. For a long time, that math worked perfectly. You have a high number of workers paying high taxes to support a smaller number of people who need help. But as 2025 rolled around, that equation started to flip in a way that feels almost impossible to ignore. It is like watching a bridge that was designed for cars suddenly trying to support a fleet of heavy semi-trucks. The structural integrity is failing, and the sound of the straining metal is getting louder every day. Look closer at the local level. In Sweden, it is the municipalities, the local towns and cities, that do the heavy lifting. They run the schools, the elder care, and the social services. By the middle of 2025, these local governments hit a wall. One verifiable event that caught national attention was a report from the Swedish Association of Local Authorities and Regions. It showed that nearly every single region in the country was facing a massive budget deficit. We are talking about billions of kroner in the red. This isn't just a rounding error on a spreadsheet. This is the kind of money that could pay for a dozen new hospitals or thousands of teachers. Picture a town hall meeting in a mid-sized Swedish city like Sundsvall. The room is packed. The lighting is harsh. On the stage, local officials are looking at a slide deck that looks like a horror story for the middle class. They are talking about closing the local library and cutting the frequency of public buses. One parent stands up and asks why her child's school can no longer afford new textbooks or even basic repairs. The official on stage has no good answer. He just points to the rising cost of caring for the elderly and the skyrocketing price of energy. This scene played out in dozens of towns across the country during the 2025 budget season. The consequence of these cuts is immediate and painful. When you pull the funding for youth centers or after-school programs, you create a vacuum. In many Swedish suburbs, that vacuum is being filled by something much darker. This leads us to the legendary Million program. Back in the 60s and 70s, Sweden built 1 million apartments to ensure everyone had a modern home. Today, many of those areas have become the epicenters of the country's social and economic tension. They are gray concrete blocks that feel disconnected from the shiny, high-tech world of central Stockholm. In one of these neighborhoods, imagine a local news crew filming a segment near a shopping square. The reporter is talking about a recent spike in small-scale robberies. In the background, you can see the boarded-up windows of a youth club that was shut down 6 months ago to save money. This is the welfare squeeze in real time. The government is spending more than ever, but the people on the ground are seeing fewer results. It is a frustrating paradox. The tax rates haven't gone down, but the quality of life feels like it is sliding backward. analysts still argue about whether the Swedish tax model has finally reached its mathematical limit. There is a real fear that if taxes go any higher, the remaining high earners will simply leave for places like Switzerland or the United States. But if taxes stay the same, the services will continue to rot from the inside out. It is a classic damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario. This debate isn't just for academics in ivory towers. It is happening at dinner tables across the country. People are wondering if the high-tax, high-service deal they signed up for is being cancelled without their consent. Then there is the demographic reality that some people call the silver tsunami. Sweden has one of the oldest populations in Europe. By 2025, the number of people over the age of 80 began to grow at a much faster rate than the number of young people entering the workforce. You notice this whenever you visit a public hospital. The waiting rooms are filled with elderly patients who require complex, expensive care. The nurses are overworked and underpaid. Many of them are quitting to work in the private sector or even moving to Norway for better pay. This creates a vicious cycle. As the healthcare system slows down, the wealthy start to buy private insurance to skip the line. This was almost unheard of in Sweden 20 years ago. It goes against the very idea of jantelagen, the cultural norm that no one should think they are better than anyone else. But when your health is on the line, cultural norms usually take a backseat. The emergence of a two-tier healthcare system is a massive blow to the national psyche. It is a sign that the folkhemmet, or the people's home, is being partitioned into VIP and standard sections. The cost of maintaining this 20th century dream in a 21st century economy is staggering. Think of the budget gap like a physical barrier, a wall of missing cash tall enough to block out the sun. To bridge that gap, some municipalities have tried to sell off public assets like housing or utilities. But that is a one-time fix. Once the assets are gone, they are gone. Meanwhile, the demand for services only goes up. It is like selling the engine of your car to pay for the gasoline. You might get a few miles down the road, but eventually you are going to come to a complete stop. Now look at the impact on the younger generation. They see their parents struggling with debt and their grandparents struggling with a failing healthcare system. For the first time in generations, young Swedes are not convinced that their lives will be better than the generation before them. You can see this in the declining birth rates. People don't want to start families when the future feels this unstable. They are staying in school longer or moving back in with their parents. The vibrant, forward-looking energy of the country is being replaced by a sense of cautious survivalism. Here's the thing about a social safety net. It only works if people trust the person holding the other end of the rope. In 2025, that trust started to evaporate. When people feel like their taxes are being wasted or that the system is being gamed, they stop wanting to contribute. This social friction is the most dangerous part of the crisis. It turns neighbors against each other and creates a political environment where extremes start to look reasonable. The emergency sessions in the Swedish parliament during the fall of 2025 were a sight to behold. There was no more talk of Swedish exceptionalism. Instead, the debates were about which essential services were actually essential. Should we fund a local pool or a police station? Should we subsidize dental care for the poor or home care for the elderly? These are the kinds of heartbreaking choices that a wealthy nation is never supposed to have to make. But here they were, arguing over the scraps of a shrinking pie. The tension is constant. It is in the way people glance at the trash piling up in the street because the collection schedule was cut. It is in the way the lights in public parks are dimmed earlier to save on electricity. It is a thousands of cuts kind of situation. No single event marks the end of the dream. It is the cumulative weight of all these small failures. You watch the sunset over a beautiful Stockholm skyline and realize that the beauty is becoming a mask. Underneath, the machinery of the state is grinding to a halt. The open door was always a point of pride for Sweden. It was a moral stance that defined the country for decades. But as the winter of 2025 settled in, that pride began to collide with some very harsh accounting. The generosity of the past had created a shadow economy that was now eating away at the formal one. It is like having a beautiful heated pool that everyone is invited to use, only to realize the water is being drained faster than the pipes can refill it. The math of a high-trust society only works when everyone is playing by the same set of rules. Think about a construction site on the outskirts of Malmö. It is a massive project, meant to be a symbol of a growing city. But as you walk past the fences, you notice something strange. There are no union logos on the trucks. The workers are speaking a dozen different languages, none of which are Swedish. This is a micro-scene that has become common across the country. These are shadow workers. They are often migrants who have fallen through the cracks of the system. They work for cash, pay no taxes, and have zero legal protections. This hidden labor market is a direct threat to the famous Swedish unions. For a century, these unions were the backbone of the middle class. They ensured high wages and safe conditions. But how do you compete with a crew that is willing to work for $5 an hour? You can't. The consequence is a race to the bottom that Sweden was never supposed to run. The high-quality, high-wage jobs are being hollowed out by a black market that the government can't seem to stop. It is a slow-motion car crash for the working class. There is a real disagreement on whether the Swedish welfare state is even compatible with an open border policy in the long run. Some economists argue that you can have a massive safety net or open borders, but you can't have both at the same time. The data from 2025 supports this. The cost of social assistance for people who are not integrated into the workforce has become the single largest line item for many cities. It is a drain on resources that was never factored into the original dream. Now, shift your focus to the streets of a wealthy suburb in Gothenburg. You notice something that wasn't there 5 years ago. High fences, security cameras on every corner, and most tellingly, black patrol cars with the words beväpning or security on the side. This is the new face of Swedish safety. Because the public police force is overwhelmed by rising gang violence and organized crime, the wealthy have started to buy their own protection. A verifiable event from mid-2025 was a report showing that for the first time, private security guards in Sweden outnumbered actual police officers. This is a massive shift in a country that used to value equality above all else. If you are rich, you live behind a wall with a guard. If you are poor, you are left to fend for yourself in a neighborhood where the police are hesitant to enter. This isn't just a safety issue. It is an economic one. The skyrocketing cost of private security is a safety tax that businesses and families are forced to pay. That is money that isn't being spent on innovation, education, or growth. It is just being spent to stay alive. The tension in the air is thick enough to cut with a knife. You see it in the way people look at each other on the subway. There is a new level of suspicion. The high-trust society, the social glue that made Sweden work, is drying up. When you don't believe your neighbor shares your values or pays their fair share, the whole system starts to crumble. You start to see a me-first attitude replacing the old, we're all in this together spirit. One major beat in this transition was a series of emergency budget filings in late 2025. The government announced that they were ending business as usual for Swedish spending. For the first time in modern history, they proposed a work-first requirement for welfare benefits. This sounds normal in the US, but in Sweden, it was a political earthquake. It was an admission that the old model of unconditional support was officially dead. The money simply ran out. Imagine a TV news segment from a snowy Stockholm evening. The host is interviewing a small business owner who just closed his bakery after 30 years. He isn't angry at his customers, he is angry at the system. He talks about the hidden costs of doing business, the insurance premiums that tripled because of local crime, the difficulty of finding legal staff who can afford to live in the city, the constant inspections from a government that seems more interested in his paperwork than his survival. This micro scene is a window into the frustration of the Swedish entrepreneur. The red tape and high taxes were fine when the streets were safe and the economy was booming. But now, it feels like an anchor. People are starting to ask why they are working so hard just to fund a system that is failing them. The consequence of this frustration is a massive brain drain. Some of the brightest young Swedes are looking at cities like Lisbon, Dubai, or Austin. They want to go somewhere where their hard work is rewarded, not penalized, to cover the mistakes of the past. Finance people still go back and forth on whether this is a temporary slump or a permanent decline, but the reality on the ground feels pretty permanent. You can't just flip a switch and fix 20 years of failed integration or a decade of underfunded infrastructure. These things take generations to build and only a few years to break. The open door was a noble idea, but the bill for that nobility has finally arrived. And the price tag is higher than anyone dared to imagine. Think about the shopping malls during the 2025 holiday season. Usually these places are packed with people spending their generous Christmas bonuses. But this year, the mood is different. People are browsing, but they aren't buying. They are looking at the price of a winter coat and calculating how many bags of groceries that could buy. The retail sector in Sweden is one of the largest employers, and it is currently in a state of shock. When the middle class stops spending, the whole economy catches a cold. There is a specific kind of silence in a country when it realizes the party is over. It is not a loud bang. It is just a quiet realization. You see it in the faces of the people waiting for the bus in the rain. You see it in the empty storefronts in the city centers. The Swedish model was beautiful while it lasted, but it was built on assumptions that turned out to be fragile. It assumed that growth would be infinite, that debt would be free, and that everyone would always want to belong to the same community. By the end of 2025, those assumptions were gone. The welfare dream had become a survival exercise. The government was no longer promising a better life. They were just trying to prevent a total collapse. It is a sobering moment for a nation that used to look down on the rest of the world from its moral high ground. Now they are looking around and realizing they are in the same boat as everyone else, and the boat is taking on water. So where does the money go? It goes to the massive bureaucracy needed to manage the crisis. It goes to the lawyers, the consultants, and the security firms. It goes to the interest payments on the mountain of debt that everyone pretended didn't exist. It doesn't go to the schools. It doesn't go to the hospitals. This is the hidden tax of a system in decline. You pay more and you get less. It is a simple, brutal reality that no amount of political spin can change. The open door led to a room that Sweden simply couldn't afford to furnish. For a long time, the world looked at Sweden as the ultimate industrial powerhouse. It was the land of giants like Volvo, Ericsson, and SKF. These were more than just companies. They were the steel and gears that kept the welfare dream moving. If the social safety net was the car, these industrial titans were the engine. But by 2025, that engine began to make some very worrying metallic clanking sounds. The ghost of industrial greatness past is now haunting the present, and it is carrying a very expensive price tag. Imagine standing on a wind-swept construction site in Skellefteå, way up in the north of Sweden. This was supposed to be the green Silicon Valley. The centerpiece of this dream was Northvolt, the homegrown battery giant meant to power the electric vehicle revolution. You look at the massive sprawling factory complex and see the vision of a carbon-free future. But throughout 2025, that vision was clouded by a brutal reality check. Reports began to surface of massive delays, technical failures, and a burning through of cash that would make a tech billionaire blush. One major beat in this industrial drama was the sudden halt of expansion plans. Northvolt, once the darling of European investors, found itself facing a liquidity squeeze that felt like a cold bucket of water. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the realization that building a green industrial base from scratch is incredibly difficult and expensive. The consequence was a wave of layoffs that sent shockwaves through the northern communities. Thousands of workers who had moved there for the green gold rush suddenly found themselves looking at empty bank accounts and a very uncertain future. Now, picture a high-stakes board meeting in a glass skyscraper in Stockholm. The air is thick with the smell of expensive coffee and cold sweat. The CEO of a major manufacturing icon is looking at a chart showing energy costs. Sweden used to have some of the cheapest electricity in the world thanks to its hydro and nuclear power. But the green transition has made the grid unstable. The CEO leans forward and says something that would have been unthinkable 10 years ago. He suggests that if the energy prices don't stabilize, they have no choice but to move their next major production line to the United States or Poland. This isn't just a threat, it is a calculation. In 2025, the Sweden-first loyalty of these industrial giants started to fray. The rigid labor market, while great for protecting workers, has become a massive hurdle for companies trying to adapt to a fast-moving global economy. It is like trying to win a Formula One race while driving a very safe, very heavy tank. You might be protected, but you are never going to be the fastest. The consequence of this rigidity is a slow leak of capital and talent to other countries. There's still a real disagreement on whether the government should have doubled down on these massive green projects. Some economists argue that the state poured too much money into prestige projects, instead of fixing the core infrastructure. Others say that without these bets, Sweden has no future in a post-carbon world. Either way, the debate is getting heated. You see the tension playing out in the opinion pages of the financial newspapers. The green dream is starting to look like a very expensive gamble that might not pay off in time to save the economy. Let's look at the numbers for a second. The amount of capital required to upgrade the national power grid is enough to build a fleet of aircraft carriers. Because the country shut down several nuclear reactors prematurely, it is now relying on weather-dependent wind power. When the wind doesn't blow, the prices spike. For a massive steel mill or a paper factory, a spike in energy prices isn't just an inconvenience. It is the difference between a profitable year and a total disaster. A verifiable event from early 2025 was when a major paper mill in central Sweden announced it was going on indefinite standby because the electricity bills were higher than the value of the paper they were producing. Think of the industrial base as the foundation of a house. For decades, the foundation was solid granite. But now, the ground underneath is shifting. The transition from traditional manufacturing to high-tech green energy has been much rockier than the brochures promised. You notice this shift in the way the Swedish krona is treated on the international markets. It has become a proxy for global risk. When people are worried about the global economy, they sell the krona. This makes everything Swedish companies buy from abroad, like raw materials or machine parts, way more expensive. Here's another micro scene for you. Imagine a union representative sitting across from a factory manager in a small industrial town like Trollhättan. They have known each other for 20 years. They usually agree on everything. But today, the manager is explaining that they can't afford the standard 4% wage increase this year. He shows the union rep the energy bills and the falling export orders. The union rep looks at the floor. He knows that if he pushes for the raise, the factory might close for good. If he doesn't, his members can't afford their rising mortgages. It is a lose-lose situation that is tearing at the social fabric of these old industrial hubs. The tension is most visible in the green steel projects in the north. This was supposed to be Sweden's ticket to the future, using hydrogen instead of coal to make steel. It is a noble goal, but by 2025, the cost had ballooned. Some analysts at the time argued that the amount of electricity needed for these plants was more than the entire country could currently produce. It was a mathematical impossibility being sold as a political certainty. When the reality hit the balance sheets, the mood in the boardrooms turned from optimistic to frantic. One notable event worth caring about was the 2025 Industrial Summit in Gothenburg. Usually these events are a celebration of Swedish ingenuity. But this year, the tone was defensive. The talk wasn't about expansion. It was about resilience and cost optimization. These are corporate code words for cutting everything that isn't nailed down. You watch the live stream of the event and realize that the leaders of Swedish industry are scared. They are facing a pincer movement of high costs at home and aggressive competition from China and the US abroad. Then there is the issue of the missing middle. Sweden has great startups and huge legacy giants, but the medium-sized companies, the ones that provide the bulk of the jobs, are being squeezed the hardest. They don't have the deep pockets of a Volvo or the venture capital of a tech unicorn. They are just trying to survive the 2025 interest rate hikes while paying some of the highest electricity rates in history. The consequence is a hollowing out of the industrial landscape. You see the empty warehouses in the industrial parks and the available signs on the factory gates. Analysts still go back and forth on whether the Swedish model can survive without its industrial backbone. If the factories leave, who pays for the hospitals? If the green transition fails, what is the plan B? There doesn't seem to be one. The country has bet everything on a specific version of the future, and now that future is looking much further away than anyone expected. It is a high-wire act with no safety net below. You watch the lights flickering in a small town factory and realize it is a metaphor for the whole country. The power is still on, but it is unstable. The people are still working, but they are tired. The machines are still running, but they are getting old. The industrial greatness that built the Swedish dream is becoming a memory. It is a slow, grinding process of attrition. It is the sound of a country realizing that you can't just wish a new economy into existence. You have to build it, and building is hard, expensive, and full of risk. The outcome of this industrial struggle will define the next 50 years of Swedish life. If the green giants like Northvolt can find their footing, there might be a path back to prosperity. But if they continue to stumble, the welfare dream will have no way to pay its bills. The consequence isn't just a lower GDP. It is a loss of national identity. Sweden was the country that built things. If it becomes a country that just talks about building things while the factories move elsewhere, something fundamental will have been lost forever. Now look at the global stage. Investors are watching Sweden closely. They see the debt, the social tension, and the industrial struggles. They are asking if the Nordic miracle was actually just a series of lucky breaks that have finally run out. The confidence that used to be a given is now something that has to be earned every single day. And in the industrial heartland of Sweden, that confidence is in very short supply. By the time the calendar flipped toward 2026, the atmosphere in Sweden had reached a point of quiet resignation. The winter air felt a little sharper, and the famous Swedish lagom, the idea of everything being just the right amount, seemed like a relic of a distant era. The 2026 budget was the final wake-up call. It was the moment the numbers stopped lying. When the finance minister stepped up to the podium, there was no talk of new social programs or grand environmental initiatives. Instead, the focus was on structural realignment. That is a polite way of saying the legendary healthcare system was getting a permanent haircut. One major beat in this final chapter was the announcement of nationwide closures of rural emergency rooms. For a country that prides itself on universal access, this was a massive blow. Imagine you live in a small town in the Swedish wilderness. You've paid into the system for 40 years. Now the government tells you that if you have a heart attack, the nearest help is a 2-hour drive away. This wasn't a temporary measure. It was a verifiable shift in policy documented in the late 2025 filings. The consequence was a surge of anger in the forgotten parts of the country, creating a divide between the urban elite and the rural working class that hadn't been this wide in a century. Now look at the younger generation. For them, the folkhemmet is paritiotos, a fairy tale their grandparents tell. You trace the movement of young professionals and see a startling trend. They are leaving, not in a panicked flight, but in a steady, calculated stream. Imagine a 28-year-old software engineer in Stockholm. She looks at her paycheck. After the 32% income tax and the 25% sales tax on everything she buys, she realizes she will never be able to afford a home in the city she loves. She sees the long lines for a doctor and the rising crime in her neighborhood. One day, she gets a job offer in Switzerland or Singapore. She packs her bags. This brain drain is the silent killer of the Swedish future. Finance people still go back and forth on whether a smaller, leaner Sweden could actually be more successful. Some argue that by cutting the fat of the welfare state, the country can finally become competitive again. Others worry that once you break the social contract, you can never truly put it back together. The outcome of this debate is still being written, but the reality is that the Nordic model, as the world knew it, is gone. It has been replaced by something harder, more competitive, and much less forgiving. Then there is the final micro scene of the green transition. You see a news report about a shuttered battery research center. The funding dried up as the government prioritized basic safety and policing over future technology. The green dream didn't die, it just got postponed indefinitely because the bills for the present were too high. This is the ultimate tragedy of the 2025 crisis. By trying to do everything at once, being a moral superpower, a green leader, and a perfect welfare state, Sweden ended up compromising its ability to do any of them well. The consequence is a nation that is finally looking in the mirror and seeing itself as it really is, not as a utopia, but as a small, cold country on the edge of Europe that has to work twice as hard to stay afloat. The arrogance is gone. The moral lectures to the rest of the world have stopped. In their place is a new, gritty realism. You watch a group of students in a university library. They aren't debating social theory, they are studying finance, engineering, and law. They know that the safety net has holes in it, and they are making sure they have their own parachutes. Think about the Stockholm metro one last time. It's still clean. It's still on time. But if you look at the faces of the people, the perfect facade has been replaced by a look of weary determination. They have survived the shock of 2025. They have accepted that the 20th century dream is over. Now, they are just trying to build something new out of the pieces. It won't be as grand or as comfortable as the old way, but it will be theirs. It's been a heavy journey looking at how such a stable place can change so quickly. Before we wrap this up, I'd love to hear from you. Where in the world are you watching this from today? How is the economy feeling in your neck of the woods right now? Do you see these same cracks forming in your own country? Or does the Swedish situation feel like a unique cautionary tale? Drop a comment below and let's talk about it. I'm genuinely curious to hear your take. If you found this deep dive into the changing Nordic landscape insightful, please give the video a like and hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel keep producing these long-form stories. We've got a lot more coming on the shifting global economy that you won't want to miss. Thanks for hanging out with me through the snow and the statistics. Take care of yourselves out there, and I'll catch you in the next one. The transition to a new Sweden is a story of resilience as much as it is a story of loss. While the old welfare dream might be fading, the Swedish spirit of innovation and community hasn't disappeared. It's just being forced to adapt to a world that doesn't offer free passes anymore. As the snow melts and a new spring arrives in 2026, the country is beginning to find its footing on this harder ground. It's a leaner, tougher Sweden, one that knows the value of every krona and the importance of a truly sustainable future.